Thank you. Sorry about the technical problems. Maya thought it would be interesting, useful for me to talk about sort of behavioral science perspective on this. The research, I should always say, is supported in part by the experiment station. The issue is that most analyses we see of energy efficiency have a hardware focus, but they don't really take consideration of who's making decisions. The other one of the other major points I want to make is there's substantial potential for mitigation by the household sector. Third major point, to estimate that potential, we have to make realistic estimates of behavioral plasticity as well as elasticity. An engineering calculation can tell you what you could get if everybody did something, or what a single house will do. But the other part of the equation has to be what proportion of houses are you actually going to get to do this? And so that's part of what we're trying to contribute here, and that's what we call behavioral plasticity. To get that savings, you've got to have effective policy. We're going to talk a little bit about what is effective policy. Effective policy has to be evidence-based, and in particular social science evidence. And then the caveat I have to add about this talk is the analysis I'm going to present is based on US data. The data to do this analysis for Michigan, by and large, doesn't exist, although it could be generated. Traditionally, we define sectors in terms of technology, transportation, industrial, residential, commercial. But for some purposes, it doesn't match decision-making very well. Transportation decisions are made by households, by government fleet managers, by railroad executives, and so on. Households, which is the sector I'm going to concentrate on, make decisions about direct in-home energy use for heating, cooling, washing, etc., transportation, and indirect use via consumption of various goods and services. For analytic simplicity, we're only going to consider direct in-home uses and transportation. That amounts to, in the US, about 626 million tons of carbon, which is 38% of total US greenhouse gas emissions, or 8% of total global emissions. That's larger than the emissions of any other country except China. It's larger than the emissions of any industrial sector in the US. In our analysis, we looked at 17 types of actions, 32 specific actions, that use existing technology or have zero or low cost or very high positive return on investment and require no lifestyle change, no real change in how you go about your day-to-day behavior. And we use behavior-based categorization, not technology-based categorization. So weatherization and heating equipment upgrades are one category because you do it once and you're done with it. More efficient vehicles and non-heating and cooling equipment, you do it once for a period of time, but many of the characteristics of the equipment matter, as opposed to the first category, where you really don't care much about your furnace except how well it keeps the house warm and how much it costs to buy and how much it costs to operate. Equipment maintenance requires periodic action, which is different. Equipment adjustments are infrequent. You do them once and they tend to stay that way. So a water heater setback, temperature setback, and then their daily use behaviors where you have to keep doing the behavior over and over again. So this is a categorization, not by the kind of technology or even the endpoint, but rather what do you have to do to make this happen, which is how a social scientist thinks about these things. So we start by estimating the number of households already taking the actions and then correcting for double counting. If you get somebody to do a thermostat setback in a well-weatherized house, you get less energy savings than if the house isn't well-weatherized. And unfortunately, a lot of the analyses in the literature don't actually take account of that. And so we have done that. So this is what we call potential emissions reductions by the different kinds of activities. And the total is 233 megatons of carbon, which is 37% of overall household emissions, 14% of US emissions, or 3% of global emissions. So if everybody in the US did all those things, that's what you'd get. But that's not realistic because not everybody is going to do all those things. So what we've done is to look at programs and policies that have actually tried to induce behavioral change in the literature and tried to figure out what has actually been accomplished by the best policies and programs we can find around the country, and we drew a few from Canada as well. These estimates are undoubtedly conservative because if you develop a new program really based on solid social scientific knowledge and evidence from past programs, and also use multiple pathways to facilitate household action, you could do better than most of the programs that we've seen. So in that sense, our action is conservative. But what we're doing is taking the figures in that last chart, which is, if you will, the engineering efficiency, and multiplying by an estimate of how many people you could, or how many households you could get to take that action in the US if you use a good program or a good policy. And that's what we call reasonably achievable emissions reductions. And unfortunately, well, what you're losing there is the old graph, so that doesn't matter. That's less than the previous graph, but again, we think this is realistic. It's 123 million tons of carbon, which is 20% of US household emissions, 7.4% of US total emissions, 1.6% of global emissions. If you're familiar with the Sokolov wedges, that's 3 of them. Or to put it in terms of President Obama's 44% reduction target, these kinds of household actions are 17% of that goal over the next 10 years. And we believe in 5 years you could get 13% household emissions reductions, because a lot of these things are fairly simple to do. So how do you do that? Well, there's 6 principles we think that you have to use in terms of designing programs and policies. First of all, you have to prioritize high-impact actions. That seems like a no-brainer, but in fact, you look at a lot of programs and they don't really think through the issue of where are you going to get substantial emissions reductions. They sort of look at things that, well, it's unclear how people are choosing what things to focus on. You have to provide sufficient financial incentives, but that's not the whole story. You have to strongly market the program so that people know about it. You have to provide credible information at the points of decision, and that can be very tricky in the household sector, because often there are parts of the household sector where credible information is somewhat hard to come by. You have to keep it simple for potential adopters, and you have to provide quality assurance. So if you're going to get your house weatherized, how sure can you be that the contractors are actually going to do a good job? Is there a source of quality assurance for you? Okay, so from that we move into the social sciences, and what do we know from the social sciences about how to make all this work? First lesson is that price is important, but it plays a limited role. Other things can be much more important than price. Second, both technology adoption and use behaviors are important. Some programs focus only on trying to get people to change behavior in terms of energy use. Others focus only on technology adoption. A successful program has to pay attention to both things. Economic incentives can actually be counterproductive. We have lots of examples in the literature where a price is put on something that was previously free, and the behavior goes in the opposite direction of what one had thought, because prior to putting a price on it, the behavior was controlled by moral norms. Shouldn't do that. But now there's a price on it, so it's okay to do it if you can pay for it. So you have to be careful about that. Decision making is limited by incorrect or incomplete information. My colleague Mike Vandenberg did a survey and asked people, what's the cut point in terms of idling the engine on your car that's optimal in terms of both energy efficiency and wear and tear in the car? And the mean response was 3 minutes. If you're going to be idling more than 3 minutes, you should turn the car off. If it's less than 3 minutes, it's better to leave the car on. The actual answer, according to EPA, is 30 seconds. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Decision making is limited by our ability to process information. We know that folks in households, but also folks in corporations making decisions about facilities management, are using discount rates that would imply things like a 38% internal rate of return, which generally speaking you can't get with legal investments. So there's sort of a problem here with how we're doing these mental calculations, even in the context of firms. The 38% figure actually comes from somebody at Johnson Controls who is in this business. And that's crazy for a manager to say, well, I've got to have a 38% internal rate of return on an investment before I'll take that investment, because there's nothing else they're doing that's providing that rate. So we often don't calculate these things correctly. Cognitive costs matter. One of our favorite comparisons is between cash for clunkers versus the home energy efficiency tax breaks that are available. Cash for clunkers, while it may not have done as much in terms of energy efficiency as it could have, was a perfect program in the sense that all the burden was on the folks trying to sell you the car, who had the incentives to make it work right, and you as a buyer had very little to think about except what kind of car you wanted and how much you were willing to pay for it. Whereas with the tax rebates, you've got to figure out what you want to put in, you've got to figure out who you're going to deal with as a vendor, you've got to file a tax return, the money comes later when you get your tax return. I could go on and on. There's just a whole series of ways in which that program is not very well designed. Choices depend on the way in which options are framed. This has come to be called behavioral nudges. We know that if you make opting out of a program the thing that takes an action, you'll get far more people into the program than if you make opting in to the program the thing that requires a positive action. People don't always act the way they feel. People may care about the environment, they may care about climate change, they may want to limit their energy consumption in their household, but there are a lot of obstacles to actually carrying out the kinds of actions that we have done the calculations for in the previous slides. So you have to think through what those obstacles are between how people might want to act and how they are acting. People follow the crowd. Talking about smart meters and the Sacramento Municipal Utilities, I think it was SMUD that did the smart metering. And they were giving people feedback on how you're doing compared to your neighbors in energy consumption. And there was a concern of, well, what happens when somebody gets the feedback that they're way below their neighbors? Isn't that going to make their energy consumption go back up? Well, there's a very simple and effective counter to that. When you gave somebody the information that you're way below your neighbor's energy consumption, you put a little smiley face on the car. That little bit of positive feedback countered the tendency to say, well, it's okay to run the air conditioner a little more because we're already below the mean. So people like these kind of normative responses. And finally, people strive for consistency. And they want a kind of whole pattern or a whole package so that if you get folks to save energy in one domain, they're likely, if you can make it look like they're being consistent to themselves, to continue to follow those patterns. So that's another lesson. So this is a real whirlwind pass through. These are the published papers where we lay out these arguments in some details. But there are three really basic points. One is there's tremendous potential right away in the residential sector. It's really low-hanging fruit that can buy us time for other options that will take longer to bring online. Second, to do that, you've got to have effective policies and programs. And third, for the programs and policies to be effective, you really have to look at the sociological and psychological literature, as well as the economic literature, that help us understand how people behave and how incentives and information and a variety of other kinds of things work. And with that, I've got us back on time.
Our speakers should get bonus green carbon credits. We've got a couple minutes before our next plenary session begins with 4:40, 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, so maybe a couple quick questions if there's any, and we have to get out of here. Yes?
For Professor Dietz, regarding the transit issue, I come from an urban planning background as well as a sociology background, and I rarely hear people address broader social systemic factors in the choice of which modes and the planning of it. Things such as social stratification, fear of crime, public health issues with using, the greater potential for contagion. It seems to me that as a personal user of CATA around this area for a long time, there are a ton of issues that really make it problematic, even for people who are trying to make these changes, because so many of our broader social forces and conflicts are really inhibiting that. And it seems like there's really no way to sell people on the ideas without also addressing some of the systemic problems socially with the divisions and segregation and things like this. Do you have any transportation-based?
Public transportation is a difficult one. I had a graduate student do his dissertation on transit choice in the Washington, D.C., basically Northern Virginia, D.C. suburbs. The first factoid is that the part of the day that everybody hates most is their commute. The second factoid is that it's people who use the Washington, D.C. area metro system like their commute a little bit better than people who car commute, but not much. People who go by bicycle or walk love their commute in contrast to everybody else. But I think that mass transit is a very difficult one to get at for exactly the reasons you're talking about, that using public transportation, whether it's a bus system or combined bus and rail system, embodies a whole lot of different factors, the kinds of things we were just listing there. And you can see how you could make some of those more positive, but some of them remain negative, and in part because of these structural issues that are really sort of social stratification issues. So I think it's an area where we need lots more work in terms of figuring out what are the real obstacles, and on which of those obstacles do we have leverage, and how much further can we take it. The one thing I would say is we can find ways. This session was very interesting to me because I had the good fortune to do my graduate work in Davis, California in the 1970s, where already in the 1970s, bicycles were the dominant mode of transportation in Davis. Everything was planned so that bicycles could be the dominant mode. There were energy conservation building codes being put into place, energy conservation retrofits on houses at the time of sale, passive solar housing in communities that were sustainable, and this is in the 1970s. So it's nice to see these issues coming back.
One more? Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Dietz as well. I'm an educator, and so I was just wondering if you research takes into account children and how you would implement research on conservation behaviors in households with small people who maybe don't experience the economic.
Yeah, well, the economics only explains a little bit of the variance. There's a good study of identical financial incentives for retrofitting households in terms of weatherization across different communities that were implemented in different ways in terms of how they were marketed. And the same financial incentives create a factor of 10 difference in the response rate. So I just want to say the economics matter, but they're not the key thing. We haven't done a lot of research on that, but our research group often remember, some of us who are a little older, the junior fire marshals. When we were kids, when I was a kid, in school you were told about things to look for in your house that might be a fire hazard. And you were a junior fire marshal. And this was very effective, I think, at changing behaviors. And so one could think about being junior energy marshals. You just have to be a little careful not to have this blow up politically. But I think that's really, I think recycling has moved a lot because of children. So if we could figure out ways to do this in a way that's non-threatening, I think it could have a lot of potential.
I wish we could take more, but unfortunately, we've got 5 minutes for our next session, and I have to moderate that one as well. So it's obvious from this discussion here that John, or Tom and John would probably be best to communicate, since you're going to be doing the same sort of things here with behavioral changes. So anyway, let's give one big hand for everybody.